My name is Elias Benavente Ortiz. I am from the beautiful country of Cuba, and as a former witch for many years, and by the grace and mercy of God I was rescued from the dark world. I want to testify how the spiritual world operates during the early hours of the morning. The testimony, what I want to make known, is based on Psalm 91, specifically in verses 5 and 6 that say, "You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor pestilence that walks in darkness, nor the death that destroys at noonday." This is a powerful psalm that speaks of divine protection at all times, but today I want to focus on what happens in the early hours of the morning. It is interesting to note that we often talk about the book of Psalms, but in reality it is 5 books in one. Not only David wrote the Psalms, so did Asaph, the sons of Korah, and even Moses. In fact, Psalm 91 was written by Moses, and in its verses it speaks of plagues and pestilences, and who better than Moses, the man who experienced firsthand how the plagues did not touch the home of the Hebrews during their time in Egypt. This psalm not only speaks of protection against evil during the day but also of the dangers that lurk in the darkness. I want to expand the subject and focus on the early hours of the morning, a crucial time in the spiritual world. I will also draw a parallel with the story of Jacob, who during a persecution with his family saw firsthand how God protected him, although the path was not always easy. When God called Abraham, then Isaac, and finally Jacob, we see how Abraham's riches passed to Isaac, and it is here where the story of Jacob takes an interesting turn, because instead of being the only heir he had to face his brother Esau. The inheritances have always passed from generation to generation. What belonged to Abraham belonged to Isaac, and so on. If Jacob had been the only one born, he would undoubtedly have inherited all the riches, but also he would have run the risk of forgetting the ways of God. Wealth often tends to corrupt the heart of man, and that is why we see that when Solomon had the opportunity to ask God for something, he did not ask for wealth but for wisdom. He understood that what he needed materially he already had by inheritance, and that the most important thing was discernment to govern with justice. If Jacob had been alone, he would have been rich, but his relationship with God could have distanced himself. God allowed Esau to be born, a rival who would push him to depend more on him. Esau was the one who put Jacob in danger, forcing him to flee and live in constant fear of being overtaken day and night. Although Jacob had been chosen by God, it was necessary for him to face this challenge. As the Bible says, "I loved Jacob and I hated Esau." It is important to clarify that this hatred is not a hatred in the sense that we understand today in Greek. The term misia means hatred. But in this Hebrew context, to hate refers to a preference for God. He does not hate anyone, and although the scriptures mention that he hurt him in his heart, that is what we call anthropopathism. A way of describing God's feelings with human terms is different from anthropomorphism, which refers to attributing human characteristics to God so that we can understand him better. God does not experience human emotions like we do. He has no weaknesses. He does not cry or laugh like we do. When in John 11:35 it says that Jesus cried, he did it as a man subject to the emotions of this world. Even so, Jesus was tempted in his humanity, but as God he cannot be tempted, and neither does he tempt anyone. This reflects the 3 essential characteristics of the human being: spirit, soul and body. On the cross Jesus gave up his spirit, saying, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." While in Gethsemane he confessed that my soul is troubled to the point of death. In addition, his body felt the needs of human beings. He was thirsty, hungry, and was even born like any human being. In summary, Jacob had to face a constant threat. Esau represented that threat that, although he could steal his earthly inheritance, connected him more with the heavenly inheritance. God allowed Esau to persecute him so that Jacob would understand that his dependence was not on what he possessed but on the heavenly resources that only God can provide. Something that always impacts me about the story of Jacob is how he had to fight for the blessing that God had already promised him. Sometimes we think that everything that God has declared about our life will come without effort, but the reality is that there are battles that we must face even when we have already been destined to receive something. Jacob had to fight, and he did it specifically during the dawn. It is important to clarify something. Jacob, he did not steal Esau's birthright. From the womb he was already destined to receive that blessing. Jacob was determined to fulfill his calling. He fought for what was his, but that fight was not just physical, it was spiritual. The Bible tells us that Jacob was alone when he began to fight with the angel. Here is a key point: God often wants to deal with us in a personal way in a time of intimacy. It is not that we need to get away from our family permanently, but there are times when God seeks a deeper and more direct relationship, moments where we must be completely alone with Him. Those moments of loneliness, although sometimes they are uncomfortable, are necessary for God to work in us without distractions. When it comes to intimacy with God, we must learn to stay alone to avoid distractions and unbridled conversations from taking us away from what really matters, that encounter with God. To Jacob, in that state of solitude, he began to fight with the angel. What impacts me is when the angel tells him to let go because the dawn breaks. That phrase has a deep meaning in spiritual warfare. Dawn is a key time for intercession and spiritual battle. According to the Bible, the day has 12 hours, but what we call a day really begins in the dark. Biblically, the day begins at dawn at 6 in the morning, but in spiritual terms, many battles are fought in the hours before, from midnight until 3 in the morning. During these hours, the Spirit connects in a special way with God. It is not a question of how long you are on your knees, but of how you connect with Him. There are people who spend hours praying but remain distracted with their minds full of thoughts that take them away from true communion. On the other hand, someone can pray alone for a few minutes and move the sky if you do it with your heart aligned. That is why it is important to learn to silence our mind, especially in the early morning when the distractions of the day are present in our subconscious. The noises and thoughts that seem insignificant during the day often resonate in our mind during those moments of prayer. We must learn to control ourselves, to silence those echoes and focus completely on God so that our prayers can have the spiritual impact that we need. Jacob in that early morning was not only fighting physically, but he was also fighting spiritually for his identity and his blessing. One of the essential characteristics to be able to enter the spiritual world is to be aware of what you are doing. Many times we act automatically even in everyday situations like driving. I have seen people who cross a red light without realizing it because although they are physically present, their mind is distracted elsewhere, perhaps in unresolved problems of the past. The same thing happens in spiritual life. There are those who carry their conscience tied to a sin they committed yesterday. Even though God has already forgiven them, that lack of mental liberation blocks their ability to pray effectively. However, between 1 and 3 in the morning, we enter a special stage known as the stage of mercy, in which God visits the earth. According to scholars, it is the same time it was when God visited Adam and asked him, "Where you are?" It was a custom of God to walk among them. Adam and Eve always heard the voice of God within themselves, but after sinning that voice became something external that scared them. The Bible mentions that God walked through the garden. The word walk implies walking aimlessly. After sin, that same voice that previously guided them internally scared them from the outside. The same thing happens today. There are people who, even when they are in prayer, when they feel afraid as if a presence was watching them. That sensation can be from an evil spirit or an angelic one. That is why I always say that not every Christian has seen an angel. To see an angel requires a level of maturity and spiritual humility. Some people do not see them but perceive them. Our intuition can capture things that the conscience cannot see. In those moments one can feel that something is present even if it is not seen with the physical eyes, and when someone manages to see an angel in a tangible way, that experience can be shocking. Sometimes people can end up idolizing the angel instead of honoring God, as it happened to the Apostle John, who tried to prostrate himself before an angel and the angel stopped him, saying, "Do not do it, I am your companion." John, a spiritual man with more experience than many of us, was tempted to do it. From 3 to 6 in the morning is a time of spiritual warfare. At that time not much is asked, but rather one fights in intercession for the liberation of your family, of your generation. And between 5 and 6 in the morning, what is called the dawn line, is a crucial moment. At that time the evil spirits make their evil plans to execute during the day in our life. That is the night terror that the Bible speaks of. On one side the dawn is near, but on the other the enemy is leaving instructions to the demons that will take over for the day. How can we ruin those plans? It is in those moments from 5 to 6 in the morning when we must be on our knees connected with God who has already visited us between 3 and 4. That divine visit of mercy gives us the spiritual fuel necessary to destroy the enemy's plans, while the demons plan. The Spirit of God enables us to break those schemes in prayer. The enemy knows that if he can distract you during those crucial hours, he can impede your progress. Sometimes you will find yourself with small distractions like a crying child or situations that take you out of focus. All this is part of the enemy's strategy so that you cannot break the chains that he has been preparing for your life and that of your loved ones. That is why many fall into a deep sleep just when they need to pray the most. The enemy knows that between 5 and 6 in the morning many people are exhausted, which makes it the perfect time to act. But if you stay in prayer by rebuking the plans of darkness and loving for your family, you can prevent those attacks from taking effect. When you enter into deep prayer, especially in the early morning, it is like entering into a spiritual battle in which you have to break the bonds of the enemy by praying from 5 to 6 in the morning. For example, you are interrupting the plans that the demons of the night have left for their replacements, the demon of daytime, that will execute during the day. There happen changes of guard between demon of the night who plan the attack and the demon of the day who execute the attack. So in the spiritual realm the devil replace a night guard on duty that has to leave clear instructions of the plan of attack, snares and trap to the demon of the day so that he can execute the plan of attack throughout the day. But when you rise up early morning in prayer and erase the plan of attack at dawn, the demon of the day would end up with a blank sheet of paper. He will take over without instruction of attack and will be disoriented, and he will try to improvise. Prayer in the dawn is crucial because there are demonic oppressions that operate at that time. At 3 in the morning the witches are doing work in the cemeteries, invoking evil spirits. In the darkness they invoke entities like Ogumbatala or the Jeds, offering them food on the graves. But we in the name of Jesus and by the blood of Christ can counteract those forces. While they carry out their works of evil, we must be in prayer rebuking and destroying those evil works. It is a real battle. The power of prayer is not something superficial, it is a war that is fought in heaven and on earth. If the witches do not sleep, what are we doing sleeping? The Bible teaches us that the children of light must be more shrewd. If the witches do not rest in their wickedness, bringing offerings to their gods, why should believers be inactive? These witches bring pieces of sweet potato and cake to the spirits in the cemeteries. Meanwhile we, the children of God, sometimes hesitate to invest in what strengthens our spiritual life. It is sad to see how some evangelicals spend large sums on technology, buying very expensive cell phones, but they resist investing in a good Bible. It is an absurd contrast. They buy a last generation phone with a bitten apple and 3 cameras, but they continue using an old Bible with missing pages, and when they are given a microphone to minister they do so without having spent time in prayer, throwing unfounded teachings and confusing people. The problem is not the lack of resources but the lack of priority. How is it that we are more invested in technology than in the deep study of the Word of God? There are those who preach without having sought God in the early morning and then made judgments without knowledge, talking about things they don't even understand. The truth is that at dawn, when everything is silent, is when one can truly find oneself and God. It is at that moment when you can meditate and reflect on everything you have said and done during the day. It is the perfect time to evaluate your actions and give yourself good advice, because at that moment everything is put into perspective. Meditation on the Word is necessary both day and night, but it is at night when it is achieved with greater clarity because the distractions of the day are not present. Unfortunately, many do not even take advantage of the night to pray or meditate. They are immersed in social media, checking Facebook or WhatsApp, wasting that precious time in which they could be in communion with God. This is how it happens in the spiritual war. As you advance in your time of prayer, God takes you to another level. Today half an hour, tomorrow an hour, the day after tomorrow 2 hours, and the more hours the more you rise spiritually. However, at the same time the enemy also intensifies his attacks. You will always face the same forces. The unclean spirit that first attacked you can bring 7 other spirits worse. As you go up in prayer, the enemy also escalates in his attack. The problem is that when you lower your prayer time, the enemy does not lower his range of attack. For example, if you have been praying 2 hours a day and then decide to go down to 1 hour for any reason such as a party or a distraction, the demon that attacks you does not lower his level, he continues with the same intensity. That is where you begin to feel that even though you prayed, the attack is still strong. That is because you lowered the level of your prayer, but the enemy did not decrease his attack. That is why it is vital that you maintain consistency in prayer. If you go down in level, you become vulnerable, but the enemy remains the same or even increases his strength. This is how Satan takes advantage when we stop praying or reduce our time in communion with God. As Paul says, so that Satan does not gain any advantage over us. The enemy observes our weaknesses, and when we let our guard down, the enemy takes advantage of it. We do not. He knows everything, but he observes and deduces. If he sees that someone spends 4 hours a day talking on the phone, for example, he knows that that person is an easy prey. Just as there are angelic relays that strengthen us in the spirit, there are also demonic relays that seek to attack our life. As I maintain this biblically, there are things that, although they are not explicit in the Bible, we can understand them by revelation. Moses, for example, was not present in Eden, but he could write about Adam and Eve's story. These are spiritual truths that are understood by the revelation of God, so those who know the power of intercession know that what we are talking about here is not a story or a fable, but a spiritual reality.